The midday sun shone brightly over the church adorned with hundreds of white flowers, each petal delicately arranged to create a dreamlike atmosphere. It was the day Valeria had been waiting for so long. A day that should have been perfect. The church bells rang, calling the arriving guests dressed in elegant attire, smiling, with the expectation of witnessing a union straight out of a fairy tale. Inside the room where Valeria was getting ready, the air was heavy with nervousness. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, wearing a radiant white gown that draped softly over her skin, each detail of the lace handcrafted. She was a vision of perfection, or at least it seemed that way from the outside. But inside, a storm of doubts was beginning to form. Was the man she was about to commit to forever really the person she thought she knew? Her heart raced as she adjusted her veil. The soft whispers of the bridesmaids filled the room, gentle giggles and words of encouragement floating in the air. Among them was Carla, her best friend since childhood, always present, always watchful. Carla couldn't help but notice Valeria's unusual anxiety. For days, something about her friend hadn't seemed quite right, but Valeria had kept silent about her worries, perhaps because even she didn't fully understand what she was feeling. When the door to the room opened softly, one of the event organizers entered with a small box in her hands. "This arrived for you," she said with a nervous smile. "There's no sender." Valeria frowned but couldn't resist her curiosity. Inside the box was a small, carefully folded letter. She opened it with trembling hands, her heart pounding as she read the words that would change her life forever. "Valeria, I know today should be the happiest day of your life, but I can't stay silent. The man you are about to marry is not who he says he is. Santiago has a dark past that he has kept hidden, and if you go through with this wedding, you are surrendering yourself to a fate from which you won't be able to escape. He has hurt many people, and he won't stop until he gets what he wants. Be careful. This is your only warning." Valeria's world stopped. Her hands began to shake even more as the words on the letter seemed to scream at her from the paper. Her mind started racing 1,000 miles an hour. What did this mean? Could it be possible that Santiago had hidden something so serious from her? She tried to recall every moment she had shared with him, every glance, every promise. Santiago had always been charming, but now, in retrospect, small details she had overlooked began to grow larger. The mysterious phone calls he avoided taking in front of her, the sudden business trips he could never fully explain. "Valeria, are you okay?" Carla's voice interrupted her thoughts. Valeria looked up at her friend, still holding the letter. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. Carla quickly approached, taking the letter and reading the words in silence. When she finished, her face darkened. "What does this mean? Who sent this? Do you know anything about what it says?" Valeria shook her head. "I don't know. I don't know what to do." Carla, always protective, took her hands. "If this is true, you have to stop the wedding. You can't marry him without knowing the truth." But how could she do that? Outside, in the church, everyone was waiting for her. Santiago was at the altar, the guests seated, the music ready to start. There was no turning back. Or was there? Valeria began pacing nervously, her mind battling between fear and reason. If the accusations in the letter were true, marrying Santiago could be the biggest mistake of her life. But what if they weren't? What if it was just a misunderstanding or a malicious lie? "Valeria," Carla said firmly, "you need to listen to your instincts. Something isn't right, and you know it. It's not normal to receive a letter like this on your wedding day. You can't ignore it." Valeria dropped the letter onto the table and turned toward the mirror. She no longer recognized the woman she saw there. Was this really the life she wanted? A life full of doubts and secrets. Finally, she made a decision. "I can't do it, Carla," she whispered. "I can't marry him." Carla nodded, though her eyes reflected concern. "Okay, what are you going to do?" Valeria took a deep breath, struggling to maintain control. "I'm leaving. I can't face this right now. I can't face Santiago or everyone out there." "But where will you go?" Carla asked, alarmed. "That doesn't matter right now. I just know I need time to think, to figure out what's happening. I can't stay here and pretend everything is okay." Carla stared at her, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I'll cover for you," she finally said. "Do what you need to do." Valeria looked at her friend with gratitude before heading toward the back door, leaving behind the church, the guests, and the future she once believed was hers. As she ran through the deserted streets of the small town, her wedding dress billowing behind her, Valeria felt the cold air of freedom but also the weight of uncertainty. The sound of the bells continued ringing in the distance, announcing a wedding that would never take place. And as the shadows of the afternoon grew longer, Valeria knew her life would never be the same again. Valeria runs without looking back, but the question burning in her mind won't let her rest. Who sent the letter? And how far is she willing to go to escape Santiago? The cold dawn wind brushed against Valeria's face as she ran through the deserted streets of the town. Her wedding dress billowed behind her, dragging dust and fallen leaves, far from the splendor it had displayed just hours before. Her footsteps echoed on the pavement, her breath heavy and ragged, and her heart pounded wildly in her chest. She felt as if her body might betray her at any moment, forcing her to collapse, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't slow down. Fear had seized every corner of her being. What was she going to do? The church, the altar, Santiago, all of it was behind her now, but so was any sense of security. Now, there was only Valeria, running into the unknown, without a plan, without direction, but with an overwhelming desire to escape. The words from the letter echoed in her mind like a warning she couldn't ignore. Santiago has a dark past. If you go through with this wedding, you'll be surrendering yourself to a fate from which you can't escape. Who could have written that? How did they know? And why had they decided to warn her at that precise moment, just before the wedding? The more questions she asked herself, the more confused she felt. But there was no time to doubt, no time to think about the details. The only thing that mattered was getting away from Santiago as fast as possible. When she reached the town's central square, Valeria stopped for a moment, gasping for air. The town was completely empty at that hour, the shops closed, the lights off. She looked around, searching for a way out, something that would offer her a chance to disappear. That's when her eyes fell on the small bus station at the end of the street. Just a booth with a worn-out sign, but at that moment, it looked like salvation to Valeria. Hurriedly, she crossed the street and approached the ticket window. There was no one else waiting, except for an older man, the bus driver, who seemed half asleep in his seat. Valeria tapped gently on the window, trying not to draw too much attention. "Where does this bus go?" she asked, her voice shaky. The driver, a man with gray hair and deep wrinkles, looked her up and down, not hiding his surprise at seeing a woman in a wedding dress at that hour of the morning. After a long sigh, he replied, "This bus is heading to San Martin, a town 2 hours from here." "But, miss, are you all right? Is this your wedding? What are you doing here alone?" Valeria swallowed hard, feeling panic rise in her chest again. She didn't have time for explanations. She didn't have time for elaborate lies. "Please, I need a ticket," was all she could say. The driver looked at her skeptically but finally nodded and sold her the ticket. Valeria climbed aboard and sat in the last row, trying to make herself small, as if she could somehow become invisible. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm her breath and her mind. But instead of finding peace, all she found were more doubts, more fear. What would happen when Santiago realized she wasn't at the church? What would he do when he discovered she had fled? Santiago wasn't the type of man who accepted no as an answer. There had always been something in his gaze that disturbed Valeria, but she had chosen to ignore it. Now, those signals seemed as clear as day. This wasn't just a failed wedding, it was something much darker. The bus engine roared to life, and little by little, the vehicle started moving. Valeria looked out the window as the town's lights faded into the distance. She felt a mix of relief and anguish. She was far from Santiago, but for how long? And what would she do when she arrived in San Martin? The moon shone brightly in the sky as the bus traveled along the lonely roads winding between hills and fields. Valeria rested her head against the back of the seat, trying to clear her mind, but memories of her relationship with Santiago began to flood her thoughts. She clearly remembered the day she met him. Santiago had been everything she had ever dreamed of in a man: handsome, successful, charismatic. He had captivated her from the first moment, with his perfect smile and promises of a life filled with love and security. Everything had seemed like a fairy tale until small cracks began to appear. There were nights when he disappeared without explanation, business trips he could never fully detail, and phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered the room. Valeria had tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, that Santiago was simply reserved and busy with his work. But now, those signs seemed like warnings she had chosen to overlook. As the bus moved forward, Valeria couldn't help but wonder, how dark was Santiago's past? What had he done for someone to warn her like that? The words from the letter kept echoing in her mind: "He's hurt many people." Suddenly, The sound of her phone interrupted her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the name on the screen, Santiago. For a moment, she didn't know what to do. Fear paralyzed her. Should she answer? Should she ignore it? The possibilities rushed through her mind, but she finally decided not to pick up. She knew that any words exchanged with him at that moment would only increase her anxiety. With trembling hands, she blocked his number, breathing deeply as she tried to hold back her tears. The bus continued on its way, but Valeria no longer felt safe. Although she was miles away, she knew that Santiago wouldn't take long to start looking for her. He wasn't the type of man to accept defeat, especially not in a situation like this. The driver announced that they would arrive in San Martin in an hour. Valeria looked around. The other passengers were either asleep or staring out the window, unaware of her internal torment. She felt completely alone. Still, she knew she couldn't let fear control her. She had to be strong. She had to find a way to stay safe. With her eyes fixed on the rapidly passing landscape outside the window, Valeria decided that when she arrived in San Martin, she would find a temporary place to stay, somewhere she could think clearly and plan her next move. She couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. Santiago had the means and the connections to find her, and he wouldn't stop until he did. The moon shone brightly over the fields as the bus moved toward the unknown. Valeria knew that her life would never be the same, and that the path to her freedom was just beginning. But one thing was certain, she wasn't going back. She couldn't allow Santiago to catch her. Not after everything she had learned. And though the future was uncertain, Valeria was determined to fight for her life, for her freedom, and for the truth she feared discovering. As Valeria approaches San Martin, the echo of her phone rings again. This time, it's not Santiago. It's an unknown number, and the message she receives makes her question everything. The bus snaked along the empty roads as Valeria watched the desolate landscape from her seat. The journey to San Martin, which had begun with a mix of fear and relief, now felt interminable. Each passing minute took her farther from her old life but also plunged her deeper into an uncertain future. What would she do when she arrived? Where would she go? She didn't know anyone in San Martin, and beyond arriving there and disappearing, she had no plan. The echo of Santiago's call still lingered in her mind. Even though she had blocked his number, Valeria knew that wouldn't be enough to keep him away. Santiago wasn't the type of man who accepted rejection, let alone abandonment. As the shadows of his past loomed over her thoughts, Valeria couldn't help but wonder what he had been hiding. The words from the letter haunted her. He's hurt many people. But who? And why? Just as Valeria began to lose herself in her thoughts, she felt a vibration in her bag. Instantly, her heart started pounding. At first, she hesitated to look, fearing it was another attempt by Santiago to track her down. But when she pulled out her phone, she saw it was from an unknown number. A cold sweat ran down her back, and her hand shook as she answered the call. Hello, her voice was barely a whisper, afraid of what she might hear on the other end. A brief, deafening silence was followed by a woman's voice. Valeria, I don't have much time. You need to listen. Valeria frowned. Who are you? How do you know my name? The woman's voice was steady, but there was an undertone of nervousness. That doesn't matter right now. What matters is that Santiago already knows you're gone. And he's not alone, Valeria. He's not going to let you get away easily. You need to be very careful. Valeria's heart raced even faster. What do you mean? Who are you? How do you know all this? The woman paused, as if deciding whether or not to continue. I'm not your enemy. I'm trying to help you. I know Santiago. I know what he's capable of. I was a victim too. Those words made Valeria's entire body tense. A victim? What are you talking about? I can't tell you everything now. You just need to know that he's done this before. The promises, the charm, it's all a facade. I warned you in the letter, he's hurt many people. And if you keep running without a plan, he'll do the same to you. You need to stay one step ahead, Valeria. Valeria pressed the phone against her ear, feeling panic build in her chest. What should I do? I don't know where to go. I don't know how to escape him. The woman took a deep breath before speaking again. When you get to San Martin, find a man named Alejandro. He can help you. But you need to be careful. Santiago has eyes everywhere. Don't trust anyone else. Before Valeria could ask more questions, the call abruptly ended. She stared at the phone screen, feeling the weight of the conversation pressing down on her like a heavy stone. Who was that woman? What did it all mean? Alejandro, she repeated in her mind. Who was this man? Could she really trust someone she didn't even know? The question swirled in her mind as the bus screeched to a stop at the San Martin station. The dim lights illuminated the small town, a peaceful and seemingly quiet place. But Valeria couldn't shake the growing sense of danger in the air. She stepped off the bus, adjusting her dress, now dirty and wrinkled after the long escape. Her footsteps echoed on the station floor as she looked around. There weren't many passengers getting off the bus, just a few locals who quickly disappeared into the darkness. Valeria made her way to the small station office, where an older man eyed her from behind the counter. His eyes narrowed as he took in her wedding dress, clearly out of place in this sleepy little town. "Can I help you?" he asked in a gravelly voice. Valeria took a deep breath, fighting to stay calm. "I'm looking for someone, a man named Alejandro. Do you know where I can find him?" The man stared at her for a moment before slowly nodding. "Alejandro lives on the outskirts of town, near the old mill. Everyone around here knows him. But miss, what are you doing here dressed like that?" Valeria didn't have time for explanations or made-up excuses. "It's a long story. Thank you for the information." She hurried out of the station without looking back as the flickering streetlights illuminated her path. As she walked, the town felt more deserted than she had imagined. The houses were shut tight, the windows dark, and not a soul could be seen on the streets. A chill ran down her spine, but she pressed on. She had to find Alejandro. He was her only hope. Reaching the outskirts of town, Valeria spotted the mill the stationman had mentioned. Beside it stood a small stone house, nestled in the shadows. The lights were on inside, offering a small glimmer of hope. She walked up to the door, but just before she could knock, a loud thud made her freeze. The door swung open, and a tall, broad-shouldered man appeared in the doorway, his face filled with suspicion. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice deep and commanding. Valeria swallowed hard, fighting the fear that threatened to paralyze her. "My name is Valeria. I was told you could help me." The man stared at her for a moment, as if weighing whether to trust her or not. Finally, he sighed and stepped back. "Come in. But if you're lying, you'd better be ready for the consequences." With her heart pounding in her chest, Valeria stepped into Alejandro's house, knowing that every step she took was leading her deeper into a web of secrets that was just beginning to unravel. Valeria has found Alejandro, but will he truly help her, or will he lead her even closer to the danger she's trying to escape? The creaking of the door closing behind Valeria echoed in the small, dimly lit living room of Alejandro's house. The air inside felt heavy, as though the secrets it held made the atmosphere even more oppressive. The soft glow of a single lamp cast shadows over the worn furniture, and the smell of damp wood filled the room. Alejandro, the stern man who had let her in, moved through the space with firm steps, glancing at her from the corner of his eye as he closed the curtains over the single window facing the street. "Sit," he instructed, motioning toward a wooden chair beside the table. Valeria hesitated for a second, her nerves keeping her on edge, but she obeyed. Her legs were tired from running, but her mind was still racing. She didn't know if she could trust Alejandro, but she had no other options. He sat across from her, folding his arms. His dark eyes scrutinized her with suspicion. "I won't ask unnecessary details," he said in a low, calculated tone. "I just want to know one thing. Who sent you here?" Valeria took a deep breath, searching for the right words. She knew she couldn't reveal everything the mysterious woman had told her over the phone. She didn't know who Alejandro really was, or what role he played in all this, but she knew she needed answers. "I was told you could help me. That you know Santiago, and that you know what he's capable of." At the mention of Santiago's name, Alejandro's face hardened further. "That bastard," he muttered through gritted teeth. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Valeria. "If you came here, it's because you've gotten yourself into something very dangerous. Santiago isn't the man you think he is." Fear gripped Valeria's body once again. She already knew this, of course, but hearing it from Alejandro made it all feel more real, more terrifying. "What exactly have I uncovered? Who is Santiago, really?" Alejandro stood up from his chair and began pacing the room, his footsteps echoing on the worn wooden floor. "Santiago has a past he's tried to bury, but his sins always follow him. This isn't the first time he's done this, tricking a woman, pulling her into his web of lies. The thing is, this time, he's gone too far. And now, you're his target. Alejandro's words hit Valeria like a bucket of cold water. Everything she had feared was beginning to come true. What has he done? What has he done to other women? She asked, her voice trembling. Alejandro stopped in front of a bookshelf filled with dusty books and old boxes. He seemed to hesitate for a moment before answering. He controlled them, manipulated them. He made them feel safe, like they could trust him, and then, once they were completely trapped in his world, he showed his true face. Some didn't make it out. A chill ran down Valeria's spine. What do you mean they didn't make it out? What did he do to them? Alejandro looked at her with a mix of sadness and rage in his eyes. Some disappeared. Others, those who tried to fight back, ended up in terrible situations. Santiago has power, Valeria. He's not just the charming man you met. He has connections to dangerous people, and if he's looking for you, it's because he can't stand the idea of someone saying no to him. Valeria's hands trembled as she processed everything. She knew Santiago wasn't a regular man, but she had never imagined he was involved in something this dark. So, what do? I can't keep running forever. Alejandro nodded, understanding the desperation in her voice. First, you need to stay off his radar for as long as possible. Here, in San Martin, you have a bit of an advantage. He doesn't have as much control in this place as he does in the city. But it won't be enough. Eventually, he'll send someone, or he'll come himself. Valeria felt her world crumbling piece by piece. No matter how far she ran, Santiago would always catch up. How do you know him? She asked, hoping to understand more about Alejandro's connection to Santiago. Alejandro's face darkened. Years ago, I worked for someone who also knew Santiago. It was during that time that I saw what he was capable of. He manipulated people like chess pieces, using their weaknesses against them. I saw it all from the inside. That's why I left that life. I couldn't be part of his schemes anymore. Valeria looked at him in disbelief. So why would you help me now? If you knew what he was doing, why didn't you stop him before? Alejandro closed his eyes for a moment, as if reliving a deep pain. I couldn't save the other women. But maybe I can save you. I don't want to see someone else fall into his hands. Valeria felt a pang of empathy for the man in front of her. She knew his motives might not be entirely selfless, but she also understood that he had seen things she couldn't even begin to imagine. And if there was anyone who knew how to protect her, it was him. Alejandro moved closer and sat across from her again. Listen, Valeria. I can't promise you'll get out of this without scars. But I can offer you a chance to fight. You'll need to be smarter than him, always one step ahead. And most importantly, never, ever trust anyone unless you're absolutely sure of their intentions. Valeria nodded slowly, knowing his words were true. She was in a world she didn't fully understand, and Santiago wouldn't rest until he found her. But at least now, she had someone on her side, someone who knew how to face him. What do we do now? She asked, her voice steadier than she had expected. Alejandro gave a faint smile, though there was no joy in it. For now, rest. Tomorrow, I'll show you what you need to know to survive someone like Santiago. But remember, Valeria, he doesn't play fair. And if you let your guard down, even for a second, he'll catch you. Valeria nodded, feeling the weight of Alejandro's words. She knew she couldn't afford to relax, not even for a moment. Santiago was close, she could feel it, and every decision she made from now on could mean the difference between life and death. Night settled over Alejandro's small house, and as Valeria lay on the couch, trying to rest, she knew her fight was only just beginning. Santiago wasn't just a man with a dark past. He was a relentless enemy, and she would have to face him in ways she had never imagined. As dawn breaks, Alejandro begins preparing Valeria for what's to come. But while she learns how to defend herself, Santiago draws closer and closer, and the danger looms larger by the minute. Will what she's learned be enough to survive the next confrontation? The dawn in San Martin arrived with a thick fog enveloping the nearby hills. Alejandro's small house remained silent, but inside, Valeria hadn't managed to sleep more than a couple of hours. The events of the previous night had left her exhausted, but her mind was still alert, filled with fear and unanswered questions. When the first rays of sunlight pierced through the window, Alejandro was already awake. He moved around the house with silent steps, preparing for the day ahead. He knew that Santiago wouldn't stop until he found Valeria, and if they were going to have a chance to escape, They needed to be prepared. Valeria got up from the sofa, still wearing her wrinkled and dirty wedding dress. Alejandro glanced at her and, without saying a word, gestured for her to follow him into the kitchen. On the table were a couple of steaming cups of coffee and a small travel bag. "You need to change," Alejandro said in his usual low, serious tone. "You can't keep walking around in that dress. It draws too much attention." Valeria nodded, grateful. As she headed to the bathroom to change into the clothes Alejandro had left her, she couldn't shake the feeling that this all still felt like a dream, or more accurately, a nightmare. Just 24 hours ago, she had been about to get married, and now she found herself running for her life, fleeing from a man she thought she knew but who turned out to be a complete stranger. When she returned to the kitchen, now dressed in a loose-fitting t-shirt and pants that were too big for her, she sat across from Alejandro, who had already spread out a map on the table. He looked directly into her eyes, his face as serious as ever. "Listen, Valeria," he began, "Santiago has people working for him, and if he's not already here, they'll come soon to look for you. Whatever you did by leaving him like that won't let him rest. He doesn't tolerate losing control, and right now, you've made him lose his power over you." Valeria swallowed, feeling the weight of Alejandro's words. She hadn't thought about the consequences of her escape, only the impulse to run. But now she was beginning to understand the gravity of what she had done. Santiago wouldn't just come after her out of pride or love. He was furious because his control over her had shattered. "So, what do we do now?" she asked, her gaze shifting to the map laid out in front of them. "First, we need to get you out of San Martin," Alejandro replied. "It's only a matter of time before someone here sees something and reports it. This town is small, people know each other, and you can't just disappear here." Valeria nodded, though deep down, she felt a pang of sadness. She had hoped that San Martin could be her refuge, but it seemed that not even in this remote place could she find safety. "Where will we go?" she asked, knowing Alejandro already had an answer ready. "I know someone in the city," he said, pointing to a spot on the map. "It's far from here, but I have an old friend who can help us move undetected. He has connections that can ensure you disappear completely. But it's going to be risky." "Risky how?" Valeria asked, her voice tinged with nerves. "They'll be looking for us. From the moment we leave this town, we'll be on Santiago's radar. He's not just a man with money, he has resources, and that makes him dangerous. You'll need to stay calm and avoid doing anything that might expose us." Valeria took a sip of her coffee, tasting the bitterness that reminded her of how bitter her situation had become. She knew Alejandro was right, but the thought of constantly being on the run terrified her. "How do you know so many people? You know a lot about Santiago, about how he operates. What did you do before all this?" Valeria asked, genuinely curious. Alejandro was silent for a moment, his gaze darkening as if he was reliving a past he would rather forget. Finally, he spoke, but his tone was distant. "There was a time when I worked for people like Santiago. I wasn't like him, but I was close to those pulling the strings. I did things I'm not proud of, Valeria. I saw things most people should never see. And after a while, I had to choose between continuing or walking away. I chose the latter. But the price I paid was high." Valeria looked at him, trying to see beyond the tough exterior Alejandro always seemed to wear. She knew he was her only hope, but she couldn't help wondering what other secrets he was hiding. Before she could ask anything else, a noise outside the house made them both freeze. Alejandro stood up quickly, putting a finger to his lips, signaling for Valeria to stay silent. He moved toward the window, carefully pulling back the curtain to peer outside. Valeria held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Had they already arrived? Had Santiago found them? Alejandro stepped back and nodded toward the back door. "It's time to go. We can't stay here." With her heart in her throat, Valeria grabbed the bag Alejandro had packed for her and followed him silently. They slipped out the back of the house, trying to make as little noise as possible. Outside, the fog still clung to the landscape, giving them some cover. They walked in silence along a path that led to the outskirts of the town. Valeria could barely see a few feet ahead, but she trusted Alejandro's steady footsteps, knowing he had a plan. "We're heading for the river," Alejandro whispered as they moved. "There's a man who has a boat. He'll take us downstream where we can get a car without drawing attention." Valeria nodded, though her mind was still in turmoil. She couldn't stop thinking about Santiago, about how she had allowed herself to be deceived by his charm. But more than anything, she couldn't stop thinking about what would come next. How long could she keep running? And what would happen when there was nowhere left to hide? When they reached the river, Alejandro pointed to a small boat tied to an old wooden dock. A middle-aged man, his face hidden under a cap, waited silently. Alejandro exchanged a few words with him, then both climbed into the boat. The engine hummed quietly as they drifted away from the dock. Valeria sat in silence, watching the riverbanks fade into the fog. She knew the danger was still close, but for the first time in days, she felt a small spark of hope. As the boat drifts downstream, Valeria begins to feel like they've bought some time. However, her phone buzzes in her pocket once again. This time, it's not a call but a message that could change the course of her escape. The soft hum of the boat's motor and the sound of water crashing against the riverbanks were the only noises that accompanied Valeria and Alejandro as they navigated through the dense fog covering the landscape. The air was thick with humidity, and the sun barely peeked through the gray clouds, creating an eerie atmosphere that seemed to foreshadow what was to come. Valeria remained silent, lost in her thoughts as she watched the shadows of the trees along the riverbanks blur with every turn the boat made. They had left San Martin behind, but Valeria knew the danger still loomed over them. Despite Alejandro's confident movements, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Santiago wouldn't give up so easily, and the fear that he was drawing closer burned within her like a flame that wouldn't go out. Suddenly, the familiar sound of her phone vibrating in her pocket interrupted the silence. Valeria's heart skipped a beat. Throughout the journey, she had tried to ignore the phone, afraid that any call or message would be a reminder of Santiago's imminent threat. But now, she couldn't resist the temptation to check. When she looked at the screen, her heart pounded. It was a message from an unknown number, and although it wasn't Santiago, something inside her told her she needed to read it. With trembling hands, she swiped the screen to open the message. "We know where you are. You can't escape." Those 5 words made Valeria's world spin. Fear gripped her with an intensity that nearly made her drop the phone. How could they know where she was? She hadn't spoken to anyone since she left the church, except for Alejandro and the mysterious woman who had called her. Were they watching her? Alejandro noticed the change in Valeria's expression, and without saying a word, he snatched the phone from her hands. He read the message in silence, his eyes narrowing with a mix of concern and frustration. "We should have gotten rid of this phone from the start," he muttered in a low, gruff voice. "They can track us easily if they have access to the network." Valeria felt a wave of panic. The thought that Santiago might be monitoring her every move was unbearable. "What do we do? I don't want them to find us. I'm not ready to face him." Alejandro tucked the phone into his pocket without taking his eyes off the river ahead. "We need to move fast. Santiago is relentless, but he hasn't caught up to us yet. From now on, don't answer any calls, don't read any messages, and above all, don't trust anyone else." Valeria nodded, though a part of her still felt vulnerable. The river meandered through the landscape, carrying the boat farther and farther from her old life. But even as the distance between her and Santiago grew, the sense of danger didn't fade. "Who do you think sent me that message?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alejandro didn't respond immediately. He knew the situation was delicate, and any wrong information could make things worse. After a long pause, he finally said, "Santiago has more allies than you think. And some of them are closer to you than you realize. But if someone sent you that message, it's because they want you to stay afraid. Don't let them control you." Alejandro's words echoed in Valeria's mind. He was right. She couldn't keep living in fear, but how do you fight an enemy who seems to be everywhere? How could she battle a shadow that knew her every move? As the boat moved downstream, the landscape began to change. The hills softened, and the fog started to lift, revealing small, scattered villages along the shore. Alejandro kept his course steady, but Valeria couldn't help noticing that his demeanor had become more tense. His usual calmness seemed to have been replaced by growing unease. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Alejandro slowed the motor and guided the boat toward an improvised dock in a more isolated part of the river. In the distance, a small, weathered cabin stood, surrounded by tall trees that blocked much of the sky. "We'll stay here for a while," Alejandro said as he moored the boat. "It's safe for now. No one knows about this place." Valeria followed him in silence as they walked toward the cabin. She couldn't shake the feeling that every second she spent in this place brought her closer to danger. They entered the cabin, and the air inside was thick, smelling of old wood and smoke. It looked abandoned, but at least it offered temporary shelter. Alejandro sat down in front of a small, unlit fireplace and looked at Valeria with an expression she couldn't quite read. You need to prepare yourself, he said seriously. Santiago is not the kind of man who stops. He will find you, sooner or later, and when he does, you have to be ready. Ready for what? Valeria asked, feeling more lost than ever. To face him. You can't keep running forever. He knows it, and deep down, so do you. This place will give you some time, but it's not a solution. Eventually, you'll have to decide whether you're going to face him or keep running. Alejandro's words hung heavy in the air like a warning. Valeria knew he was right, but she couldn't imagine confronting Santiago. How could she stand up to someone who had controlled every aspect of her life? Someone who was now hunting her down like an object he had lost and wanted back at any cost. As the day wore on, Valeria sat by the window, watching as the sun slowly began to set on the horizon. The shadows lengthened, and the echo of the message she had received still reverberated in her mind. We know where you are. You can't escape. It was a threat, but also a reminder that Santiago was always one step ahead. As the sky darkened, Valeria knew she would soon have to make a decision. She couldn't keep hiding forever. At some point, she would have to confront her past, Santiago, and everything she had left behind. But for now, all she could do was wait. As night falls and the danger grows ever closer, Valeria receives a new revelation that changes the course of her escape. As she prepares for the inevitable, an unexpected person enters the scene, bringing answers that Valeria wasn't ready to hear. Night had completely fallen over the small cabin in the woods, wrapping Valeria and Alejandro in deep darkness. The silence was almost unbearable, broken only by the occasional creaking of the wood and the whisper of the wind moving through the trees. Valeria sat by the window, unable to tear her eyes away from the eerie landscape outside. Every shadow that shifted, every strange noise, made her think Santiago was closer than she imagined. The message she had received continued to torment her. We know where you are. You can't escape. Even though Alejandro had told her not to let fear control her, Valeria couldn't shake the growing anxiety. Santiago was not a man who gave up easily, and now, more than ever, she knew he was searching for her, willing to do whatever it took to find her. She was sure his footsteps were already echoing nearby. Alejandro, who had been studying a map on the small kitchen table, finally stood up and looked at her. His usually calm eyes appeared more restless than usual. He knew that the situation was reaching a critical point of no return. We need to move soon, he said gravely, breaking the tense silence. We can't stay here any longer. The message you got is a warning, but it also means they're closing in on us. Valeria nodded silently, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew Alejandro was right. Staying there was too risky. Santiago, or someone working for him, was close, and the feeling of danger was intensifying with every minute that passed. Where are we going? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though it betrayed her growing fear. Alejandro stared at her for a few seconds before answering. I have a contact in the city, someone who can provide us with fake documents and the means to disappear completely. If we reach him, you'll have a chance to start over, far from all of this. But getting there won't be easy. Valeria knew she had no other option. The risk of continuing to run was high, but staying and facing Santiago was even more dangerous. She could no longer afford to hesitate. She had to trust Alejandro and his plan. Alejandro walked to a small cabinet in the corner of the room and pulled out a backpack that seemed ready for any emergency. We leave as soon as the sun starts to rise. We can't travel at night, it's too dangerous. But we can't waste any more time. Valeria watched as he prepared everything. It was clear that Alejandro knew how to operate in dangerous situations. His past, still a mystery to her, seemed to have trained him for moments like this. He knew how to act, how to anticipate his enemy's movements. This gave Valeria a small glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could survive this. The minutes dragged by. The tension in the air was palpable. Valeria tried to rest, but her thoughts wouldn't let her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Santiago's face, remembering the empty promises, the lies he had told. She had been so naive, blindly trusting him, and now she was paying the price. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Alejandro came back over to her. It's time to go, he whispered. We need to leave before it's too late. Valeria nodded, her hands trembling as she stood up from where she had been sitting. Alejandro handed her a jacket and a cap to cover herself. Keep your head down. We can't draw any attention. They left the cabin in silence, stepping into the dense forest. The darkness still clung to the landscape, though the first signs of dawn were beginning to illuminate the horizon. Alejandro walked ahead, his steps firm and determined, while Valeria followed, trying not to trip over the roots and stones on the path. The cold morning wind cut against her face, but Valeria barely noticed. Her mind was focused on one thing: escaping. She knew Santiago was searching for her, that he wouldn't stop until he found her. And the only way to survive was to stay one step ahead. After what felt like hours of walking, Alejandro suddenly stopped. Valeria, confused, looked at him with concern. "What's wrong?" she whispered. Alejandro raised a hand, signaling for her to stay quiet. Then, with slow, calculated movements, he pulled a small mirror from his backpack and used it to observe what lay ahead without exposing himself. Valeria held her breath as she waited for him to speak. Finally, Alejandro lowered the mirror and looked at her. "They're here." Valeria's heart skipped a beat. How had they gotten there so fast? "What do we do?" she asked, feeling fear begin to take over again. Alejandro gripped her arm firmly. "We hide. They can't know we're here. If they see us, we're done." Adrenaline rushed through Valeria's body as she followed Alejandro to a small hidden area among the trees. They crouched behind some bushes, trying to make as little noise as possible. The sound of footsteps and voices grew louder with each passing second. Valeria could feel her heart pounding, terrified that at any moment they would be found. Through the shadows, Valeria managed to make out the figures of two men walking along the path. She couldn't see their faces, but she knew they had been sent by Santiago. Every word they exchanged was a threat to her life, every step they took a reminder that danger was closer than she had ever imagined. Minutes passed slowly, but finally, the men moved away, disappearing into the fog that still shrouded the forest. Valeria let out a sigh of relief, though her body remained tense. Alejandro looked at her seriously. "This isn't over. We need to keep moving." Valeria nodded. She knew her nightmare was far from over, but for now, they had managed to avoid being caught. As they continued their journey, the question that burned in her mind refused to go away: how much longer could she keep running? As Valeria and Alejandro continue their dangerous journey toward the city, Santiago draws closer with every step. The stakes are rising, and Valeria realizes she will soon face the most important confrontation of her life. Will she be ready to face the truth? The sun began to peek over the horizon, bathing the dense forest in a soft, golden light. Valeria and Alejandro walked in silence, their steps quick and cautious as they made their way through the trees and underbrush. Each step brought them closer to their destination, but also deepened the uncertainty growing inside Valeria. She couldn't help but look over her shoulder, feeling Santiago's constant presence looming like a shadow. It had been a long night, full of tension. Although they had managed to escape Santiago's men the last time, the danger still hung over them like a storm waiting to break. The message Valeria had received continued to haunt her, echoing in her head like a warning she couldn't ignore: "We know where you are. You can't escape." With each step, her breath felt heavier, not just from the physical exertion but from the weight of the fear she carried. Alejandro walked a few paces ahead, his face as serious and focused as always. Valeria knew that her survival depended on him, but deep down, the uncertainty of what lay ahead suffocated her. After hours of walking in silence, Alejandro raised his hand, signaling Valeria to stop. Ahead of them stretched a clearing in the forest, where a small dirt road wound toward the main highway. It was the first sign of civilization they had seen in hours. Alejandro pointed to a car parked in the distance, almost camouflaged by the trees. "That's our ride," he said in a low voice, not taking his eyes off the vehicle. "My contact left it there so we could continue the journey. If everything goes as planned, we'll be in the city before noon." Valeria nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Alejandro, usually so cautious, seemed more tense than usual. His gaze scanned the perimeter of the clearing, as if expecting something or someone to be watching them. As they began to approach the car, a chill ran down Valeria's spine. The sensation of being watched intensified with every step. Suddenly, the sound of branches snapping behind them broke the silence. Valeria spun around, and her heart stopped when she saw a figure emerging from the trees. It was Santiago. His face was obscured by the shadows of the trees, but Valeria instantly recognized the imposing presence, the figure that had filled her days with promises and her nights with doubts. The man she once thought she loved stood there, glaring at her with a mixture of rage and determination. "I knew you couldn't escape me," Santiago said, his voice both soft and menacing. His gaze was fixed on Valeria, but there was a dangerous glint in his eyes, a madness he had once hidden so well behind his charm. Alejandro, wasting no time, moved in front of Valeria, blocking her from Santiago. "Valeria, stay behind me," he ordered quietly, never taking his eyes off Santiago. Santiago smiled, but it was a smile that never reached his eyes. "Do you really think you can protect her? You know this won't end well for either of you." He took a step forward, his hands relaxed at his sides, but every movement radiated danger. Valeria felt the air grow heavier, each passing second sinking her further into panic. But something inside her had shifted. The fear was still there, but now there was also a burning desire to never let Santiago control her life again. She no longer wanted to be the victim who ran. It was time to face her reality. Alejandro prepared for what was clearly an imminent confrontation. "You don't have to do this, Santiago," he said calmly, though his stance remained defensive. "This can end differently. Let her go. You have no right to keep her." Santiago laughed, but it was not a laugh of joy. It was cold, the laugh of someone who knew they had control. "Let her go. You don't understand. Valeria is mine. She has been since the moment she chose to be with me, and she will continue to be, no matter how hard she tries to run." Valeria felt Santiago's words crash over her like a heavy wave. For so long, she had been under his influence, trapped in his manipulations. But now she saw things clearly. Santiago had never loved her. He never had. To him, she was just a possession, something he could control and manipulate at will. "I'm not yours," Valeria shouted, surprising even Alejandro with the force of her words. "You have no right over me. I'm not your property." Santiago's eyes narrowed, and his smile slowly faded. "That's what you think. But what you don't understand, Valeria, is that you can't just get rid of me. I will find you. I will always find you." Seeing that the situation wasn't going to end peacefully, Alejandro lunged at Santiago. The struggle was fast and violent. Santiago, though seemingly calm, was strong and ready. The two men rolled on the ground, exchanging blows with a ferocity that left Valeria frozen in shock for a moment. Alejandro was gaining the upper hand, but Santiago wasn't easily defeated. Valeria stood there in a state of shock, her hands trembling as she tried to decide what to do. But suddenly, Santiago pulled a knife from his jacket and aimed it at Alejandro. Without thinking, Valeria ran toward them, trying to intervene before the worst could happen. With a strength she didn't know she had, Valeria managed to push Santiago, knocking him to the side. Alejandro seized the moment to disarm him, but the fight was far from over. Santiago quickly got back to his feet, his eyes filled with fury. "This isn't over," he spat, his words dripping with hatred. "You can run all you want, but you will never truly be safe from me." Alejandro, breathing heavily but determined to protect Valeria, stood between them again. "I'll leave now, Santiago. You have a chance to walk away from this, but if you come near Valeria again, I swear there won't be a place you can hide." Santiago looked at them with contempt before taking a step back. "This isn't over," he repeated, with a latent threat in his voice. Then, without saying another word, he disappeared into the forest, his footsteps fading into the distance. Valeria, trembling, collapsed to the ground. The confrontation was over, but the danger still loomed. Alejandro knelt beside her, breathing deeply. "You did well," he said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "But this isn't over. Santiago won't give up easily." Valeria knew it. The danger hadn't vanished, but something inside her had changed. She was no longer the terrified woman who had fled her wedding. She had faced her fear and survived. And now, more than ever, she was determined to keep moving forward, to fight for her freedom. Valeria has faced Santiago and survived the first confrontation. But the threat of his return is still very real, and as Alejandro and she plan their next move, Valeria must decide just how far she's willing to go to end this nightmare once and for all.